In the winter of 1349, when the Black Death had already devoured half of Christendom, a young monk named Brother Thomas walked barefoot through the frozen countryside, believing that only blood could wash away the sins that had brought such horror upon the world. Good evening, dear listener. As you settle into your rest tonight, let me take you back through the mists of time to a winter long ago, when faith burned as fiercely as fever, and desperate souls sought redemption in the strangest of ways. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let us journey together into this tale of devotion, suffering, and the enduring human spirit. Brother Thomas was 23 years old in that terrible winter, though grief had etched lines around his eyes that made him appear much older. He had been born Thomas Carpenter in the village of Ashford, in the county of Kent, the third son of a wheelwright who had hoped his boy might learn the family trade. But Thomas had always been different from his brothers. While they hammered and shaped wood with confident, calloused hands, young Thomas would slip away to the village church, where he would sit for hours in the cool shadows, watching the way the light fell through the narrow windows onto the stone floor, creating patterns that seemed almost like messages from God himself. His mother, Agnes, had been a gentle woman with kind eyes, and a voice that could soothe even the most frightened child. She had noticed Thomas's inclination toward spiritual matters when he was barely 7 years old, when she found him one morning before dawn, kneeling in the garden with his small hands pressed together in prayer, his lips moving silently as he spoke to God about the sparrow he had found dead beneath the oak tree. Agnes had understood then that her son would not follow his father's trade, and she had encouraged him quietly, in ways that would not anger her husband, who believed that prayers were for priests and work was for honest men. When Thomas was 14, a Benedictine monk named Brother Anselm passed through Ashford on his way to Canterbury. The monk had stayed 3 days at the village church, and Thomas had attended every moment he could steal away from his father's workshop. Brother Anselm spoke of the monastery at Canterbury, of the ordered life of prayer and work, of the beauty of serving God with every breath and heartbeat. He spoke of illuminated manuscripts that glowed with gold and azure, of voices raised in chant that seemed to lift the very soul toward heaven, of a peace that passed all understanding. Thomas listened with his whole being, and when Brother Anselm departed, the boy's heart went with him. It took 2 years of careful persuasion, of extra work in the workshop to prove his dedication, of conversations with the village priest who advocated on his behalf, before his father finally relented. Robert Carpenter was not a cruel man, merely a practical one, and he could see that his son's spirit would wither if kept from its calling. On a cool autumn morning when Thomas was 16, his father walked him to the edge of the village, pressed a small leather pouch containing 3 silver pennies into his hand, and told him gruffly to honor his family name, even if he would no longer bear it as a craft. His mother had wept quietly and given him a small wooden cross that she had commissioned from her husband in secret, carved with such delicate care that Thomas could feel the love in every curve and line. The monastery of St. Augustine at Canterbury had accepted Thomas as a novice, and he had thrown himself into religious life with all the fervor of youth. He learned to read Latin, stumbling at first over the strange words, but gradually finding them as familiar as his native English. He learned to write with a careful hand, forming letters on precious vellum under the patient instruction of the scriptorium master. He learned the divine office, the 8 periods of communal prayer that structured each day, waking in the dead of night for matins, his breath steaming in the cold chapel as his voice joined with his brothers in psalm and hymn. He learned to fast, to work, to find God in the simple act of pulling weeds from the monastery garden or copying a single page of scripture. But he also learned that the monastery was not the perfect haven of peace he had imagined. There were petty jealousies among the brothers, disputes over trivial matters that seemed absurd in a place dedicated to transcending earthly concerns. There was Brother Dominic, who hoarded extra portions of bread. There was Brother Geoffrey, who claimed to have visions but whom others suspected of prideful invention. There was Prior Walter, whose stern discipline sometimes seemed to cross into cruelty, who would assign harsh penances for the smallest infractions, who seemed to find more pleasure in punishment than in mercy. Yet Thomas had found his place among them. He had found friendship with Brother Edmund, a young monk only 2 years his senior, who shared Thomas's love of learning, and who could discuss theology for hours by candlelight when they were supposed to be sleeping. Edmund came from a merchant family in London, and he brought a practical wisdom to balance Thomas's sometimes overly mystical inclinations. They had laughed together, prayed together, and weathered the difficulties of monastic life side by side. Then the pestilence came. It arrived in the autumn of 1348, creeping up from the southern ports like some invisible demon, leaving death in its wake. At first, the monastery heard only rumors, whole villages dying in a matter of days, bodies piling up faster than they could be buried, physicians fleeing in terror when their remedies proved useless against the swift and terrible disease. The monks prayed for protection, they fasted, they increased their devotions. But prayer, it seemed, could not stop what was coming. The first to fall ill was Brother Martin, the seller who managed the monastery's provisions. He had been to Canterbury Market to purchase supplies and returned complaining of a headache and chill. By evening, he was burning with fever. By the next morning, he had dark swellings in his neck and armpits, and he was coughing blood. He died 3 days later, his body covered in the dark blotches that gave the plague its common name, the Black Death. After Brother Martin came others: Brother Dominic, Brother Hugh, Brother Peter. The infirmary filled and then overflowed. The monastery's physician, Brother William, who had studied at Paris and prided himself on his medical knowledge, tried everything: bloodletting, poultices of herbs, prayers, and holy water. Nothing helped. Brother William himself fell ill and died within a week, his medical knowledge as powerless as ignorance against the pestilence. Thomas and Edmund volunteered to care for the sick, knowing they risked infection. What else could they do? These were their brothers, men they had lived beside, prayed beside, men who had become their family. They brought water to cracked lips, changed soiled bedding, held trembling hands, whispered prayers over those who could no longer speak. The smell of death became so familiar that Thomas could no longer remember what the world smelled like before. The sweet scent of summer grass, the warmth of baking bread, the clean smell of rain on stone. Now there was only the stench of sickness, the cloying smoke of incense that failed to mask it, the acrid smell of fear. Edmund fell ill on the feast of St. Lucy in December. Thomas had just finished matins when he found his friend huddled in the corner of their cell, shivering despite the pile of blankets someone had given him. Edmund's eyes were bright with fever, and when Thomas touched his forehead, it was like touching fire. "It's got me, Thomas," Edmund whispered, his voice hoarse. "I can feel it." Thomas had known this moment might come, had prepared himself for it through weeks of watching others die. But nothing had truly prepared him for seeing his dearest friend marked by the plague. He knelt beside Edmund, taking his burning hand in his own cold one. "I'll stay with you," Thomas said. "Every moment. You won't face this alone." Edmund tried to smile. "You should keep your distance. You could still escape it. I won't leave you." For 4 days and nights, Thomas stayed by Edmund's side. He brought wine mixed with water to ease the fever. He read scripture aloud when Edmund was conscious enough to hear, choosing the psalms that spoke of God's mercy and protection. He sang the hymns they had learned together, his voice cracking with exhaustion and grief. He wiped the blood from Edmund's lips when the coughing fits came. He pretended not to notice when Edmund soiled himself, simply cleaned him and changed his robes with gentle efficiency, trying to preserve his friend's dignity even in the midst of such degradation. On the 4th night, Edmund's fever broke slightly, and he seemed more lucid than he had been in days. The swellings in his neck had grown enormous, dark and angry, but his eyes were clear as he looked at Thomas in the candlelight. "Do you think God is angry with us?" Edmund asked. "Is that why this is happening?" Thomas had been asking himself the same question for weeks. The priests preached that the plague was divine punishment for sin, that God's wrath had been kindled against a corrupt and wicked generation. But what sins had Edmund committed? What had the children done, the innocent bobbies who died in their mother's arms? What crime had old brother Paul committed, who had spent 60 years in faithful service to God, only to die choking on his own blood? "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I want to believe there's a reason, a purpose to all this suffering. But I don't know." "Promise me something," Edmund said, his grip on Thomas's hand surprisingly strong. "If you survive this, and I think you will, Thomas, I think God has other plans for you. Promise me you'll try to make sense of it. Promise me that my death, that all these deaths won't be meaningless." "I promise," Thomas whispered, though he had no idea how he could possibly keep such a promise. Edmund died just before dawn, as the bells were ringing for lauds. His last words were a prayer, the same prayer they had said together countless times. Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Thomas had wept then, the tears he had been holding back for weeks finally breaking free. He had wept for Edmund, for all the dead, for the senseless waste of it all. He had stayed with the body until the other brothers came to prepare it for burial, and then he had walked out into the frozen December morning, numb with grief and exhaustion. By Christmas, half the monastery was dead. The survivors moved through their duties like ghosts, their voices hollow when they sang the Christmas hymns that should have been joyful. The abbot himself had died, and Prior Walter had taken command, ruling with an even harsher discipline than before, as if strict adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict could somehow ward off the pestilence that paid no attention to rules or prayers. It was in January, when the dead of winter matched the death all around them, that the Flagellants came to Canterbury. Thomas first heard of them from Brother Lawrence, who had been to the city to arrange for the purchase of supplies. Lawrence returned with wild stories of processions of men marching through the streets, stripped to the waist despite the bitter cold, whipping themselves with leather scourges studded with metal points until their backs ran with blood. They sang hymns as they struck themselves, crying out for God's mercy, proclaiming that only through such penance could humanity appease the divine wrath that had sent the plague. "They say they've come from the continent," Brother Lawrence explained to the assembled monks at supper that evening. "From Germany and the Low Countries, where the pestilence has been even worse than here. They believe that if enough people do penance, if enough blood is shed in voluntary suffering, God will relent and spare what remains of Christendom." Prior Walter snorted with contempt. "Heretical nonsense. The Church does not sanction such displays. These are laymen presuming to know the mind of God, taking salvation into their own hands instead of submitting to the guidance of the Holy Mother Church." But Thomas had listened with a strange stirring in his heart. What if the Flagellants were right? What if God demanded more than prayers and fasts? What if the only way to make sense of Edmund's death of all the deaths was to offer something more, to show God that humanity was willing to suffer, to bleed, to pay the price for its sins? He couldn't stop thinking about it. That night and the nights that followed, he lay awake in the cell that now felt too large without Edmund's presence, thinking about the Flagellants. He remembered Edmund's last request, to make sense of the suffering, to ensure the deaths weren't meaningless. Perhaps this was the answer. Perhaps this was what God wanted. A week later, Thomas made his decision. He rose before matins while the other monks still slept, and gathered his few possessions. The wooden cross his mother had given him, a small testament he had copied himself, a spare robe, and a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. He took a length of rope from the storeroom, and from the leather scraps in the cobbler's workshop, he fashioned a crude scourge, similar to the ones Brother Lawrence had described. He left a note for Prior Walter, explaining that he had gone to join the Flagellants, to do penance for the sins that had brought the plague upon them, to try to appease God's wrath and save what remained of humanity. He walked out into the winter darkness, leaving behind the only home he had known for 7 years, following what he believed was God's calling, even if the church called it heresy. The frost crunched beneath his feet as he made his way along the road toward Canterbury. The moon was nearly full, and its light reflected off the snow-covered fields, turning the landscape into a strange, dreamlike vista of black and silver. His breath steamed in the cold air, and already his feet were going numb in his thin leather sandals. He had left his warmer boots behind deliberately. If he was going to do penance, if he was going to offer suffering to God, then he should begin immediately. He walked for hours through the frozen night, his mind filled with prayers and doubts in equal measure. What was he doing? Was this truly God's will, or was it madness born of grief? Prior Walter would certainly say it was the latter. The church authorities would condemn him as a heretic, a dangerous fanatic. But Thomas couldn't shake the conviction that this was what he needed to do, that Edmund's death had to mean something, that all the suffering had to serve some purpose. Dawn broke gray and cold as he crested a hill and saw Canterbury in the valley below. The great cathedral rose above the other buildings, its towers pointing toward heaven like prayers made stone. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and even from this distance, Thomas could hear the bells ringing for prime. The city looked peaceful, almost normal, but he knew that within its walls the plague still raged, still claiming victims every day. He found the Flagellants in the cathedral square. There were perhaps 30 of them, men of all ages and conditions. Some looked like merchants or craftsmen, with the soft hands and well-fed appearance of the prosperous. Others were clearly laborers, their bodies lean and hard from years of physical toil. A few looked like minor nobles, with the bearing and speech patterns of the educated. But here, stripped to the waist in the freezing morning air, their backs already crisscrossed with scars and fresh wounds, they were all equal in their suffering. Their leader was a man named Heinrich, a German who spoke English with a thick accent. He was perhaps 40 years old, with a gaunt face and eyes that burned with fervent intensity. When Thomas approached and explained that he wanted to join them, Heinrich studied him carefully. "You are a monk," Heinrich said. It was not a question. "I was," Thomas replied. But the monastery's prayers did not stop the pestilence. "Half my brothers are dead. I believe God demands more from us." "God demands everything," Heinrich said. "Your comfort, your pride, your very blood. Are you prepared to give all this?" "I am." Heinrich nodded slowly. "Then strip to the waist and join us. We process through the city, stopping at each church to pray and perform our penance. We do this 3 times each day, at prime, at sext, and at vespers. The rest of the time, we fast and pray. You will eat only bread and water. You will sleep on the ground, with no covering but your cloak, even in this winter cold. You will own nothing but what you can carry. And you will scourge yourself until the blood flows, offering your pain to God as payment for humanity's sins. Can you do this?" Thomas thought of Edmund, of his promise. "I can." He removed his outer robe, standing bare-chested in the bitter cold. The shock of it took his breath away. The other flagellants were forming into a procession, 2 by 2, their scourges in hand. Heinrich took his place at the front and began to sing. The hymn was in Latin, a plea for mercy. Stabat mater dolorosa, eux de crucem lacrimosa. The sorrowful mother stood weeping beside the cross. The voices of the flagellants rose together, hauntingly beautiful despite the rough quality of some of the singers. Then, in unison, they raised their scourges and brought them down upon their own backs. The sound was like distant thunder, the crack of leather on flesh multiplied 30-fold. Some of the men cried out. Others gritted their teeth in silence. Thomas hesitated for just a moment, his homemade scourge feeling heavy in his hand. Then he thought of Edmund's burning fever, of Brother Martin coughing blood, of all the dead, and he brought the scourge down hard upon his own shoulder. The pain was shocking, more intense than he had expected. It was not like the small hurts of daily life, a cut finger, a bruised shin, a headache. This was a fierce, burning agony that seemed to radiate through his entire body. He gasped and tears sprang to his eyes. But even as he felt the pain, he also felt something else, a strange sense of purpose, of doing something concrete, something physical, in response to all the helpless grief of the past months. They struck themselves in rhythm with the hymn, each line punctuated by the crack of the scourges. Blood began to flow, running down backs in thin streams, dripping onto the snow, staining it crimson. The flagellants processed through the square, and people came out of their houses to watch. Some looked horrified. Some looked moved, falling to their knees in prayer. A woman called out, begging them to pray for her dying child. An old man wept openly, whether from pity or some inner conviction, Thomas could not tell. They stopped at the cathedral itself, where a crowd had gathered. The flagellants knelt in the snow, continuing to strike themselves as they prayed aloud for God's mercy, for an end to the pestilence, for the souls of the dead. Thomas knelt with them, his back now streaming with blood, his whole body shaking from cold and pain and a strange exaltation. He felt that he was doing something holy, something necessary. He felt that Edmund somehow was watching and understanding. A priest emerged from the cathedral, his face stern with disapproval. "This is not sanctioned by the church," he announced. "You men are heretics, taking the sacrament of penance into your own hands. Cease this display immediately and submit to proper ecclesiastical authority." Heinrich rose to his feet, blood still dripping from his wounded back. "We submit to God's authority," he said calmly. "The church has prayed and performed its rituals, yet the pestilence continues. We offer what the church has failed to offer: true penance, true suffering, true sacrifice. If we are heretics for trying to save humanity, then we are heretics gladly." The priest opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, a woman in the crowd cried out, "My husband died last week. My 2 sons are sick to death. If these men can stop this horror, let them do what they will. What has the church done for us? You priests stay safe in your churches while we die in the streets." Others in the crowd murmured agreement. The priest looked around, saw the anger and desperation in the faces surrounding him, and wisely retreated back into the cathedral. The Flagellants resumed their procession, moving through the city streets, and a crowd followed them, some praying, some weeping, some simply watching in awed silence. By the time they completed their circuit and returned to the square, Thomas's back was a mass of pain. He had never imagined that suffering could be so intense, so all-consuming. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through him. The cold air stung his wounds. His hands shook as he put his robe back on, and he nearly cried out as the rough wool fabric touched his torn flesh. Heinrich approached him, showing no sign of his own suffering, though his back must have hurt as badly as Thomas's. "You did well," he said. "Many men cannot complete even one procession their first time. But you must understand, this pain you feel now, it is nothing compared to what Christ suffered on the cross. It is nothing compared to what the souls in purgatory suffer. It is nothing compared to what we deserve for our sins. This is just the beginning." Thomas nodded, too exhausted to speak. Heinrich led him to where the other Flagellants were gathering in the shelter of a church wall. They had lit a small fire, though they did not huddle close to it for warmth. That would have been too much comfort, too much softening of their penance. They sat instead at a distance from the flames, eating small pieces of bread and drinking water from a shared flask. A young man about Thomas's age introduced himself as Peter, originally from Sussex. "I joined them 3 weeks ago," he said quietly. "After I buried my entire family, my parents, my wife, my infant daughter, all dead within a week. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just go on living as if nothing had happened. This gives me something, a purpose, a way to fight back, even if we're just fighting with our own suffering." Thomas understood completely. That was exactly how he felt. He asked Peter about the life of a flagellant, and Peter explained the routine. 3 processions each day, hours of prayer in between, constant movement from town to town. They never stayed in one place more than a few days. The church authorities disapproved of them, sometimes violently. In some towns, they were welcomed as holy men. In others, they were driven out as heretics and troublemakers. "Heinrich believes we should make our way north," Peter said, "through the Midlands and eventually to Scotland. He says we must cover as much ground as possible, performing penance in every town and village, so that God will see that humanity is truly sorry, truly repentant. Only then will he lift the plague." "And do you believe it's working?" Thomas asked. "Do you believe the plague is lessening?" Peter was quiet for a moment, staring into the small fire. "I don't know," he finally said. "People still die every day. But some survive too. And those who see us, those who hear our message of repentance, I think something changes in them. They take their faith more seriously. They try to live better lives. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can do. That night Thomas slept, or tried to sleep, on the cold ground with only his thin cloak for covering. The stones beneath him dug into his bones. His wounded back throbbed with every heartbeat. He was colder than he had ever been in his life, colder even than the winter nights when he had served night office in the monastery, because then he had at least been able to return to a cell with a brazier and a straw mattress. Now there was nothing but the hard earth and the bitter wind and the stars overhead, distant and cold, as the mercy of God seemed to be. He thought of his mother's warm kitchen, of hot pottage and bread fresh from the oven. He thought of his father's workshop, where the forge glowed red and drove back the winter chill. He thought of his cell at the monastery, sparse but clean, with Edmund in the next bed, the two of them whispering theology and gossip before falling asleep. All of that is gone now. He had chosen this path, this life of deliberate suffering, and there was no going back. As he lay there shivering, unable to sleep, he heard someone moving nearby. It was Heinrich, who apparently slept as little as he ate. The German flagellant came and sat near Thomas, not close enough for warmth, but close enough to talk quietly without disturbing the others. "You are thinking this was a mistake," Heinrich said. "It was not a question." "I'm wondering if I have the strength for it," Thomas admitted. "No one has the strength for it," Heinrich said. "That is the point. We cannot do this through our own power. We must rely entirely on God's grace. Our weakness is what makes our sacrifice meaningful. If it were easy, it would be worthless." "How long have you been doing this?" Thomas asked. "Since the beginning of the plague, nearly 2 years ago. I was a cloth merchant in Strasbourg, a wealthy man with a fine house, a beautiful wife and 3 children. Then the pestilence came. My wife died first, then my daughter's twins, 8 years old. My son fought for days, and I thought he might survive. I prayed constantly. I promised God everything, my wealth, my life, anything, if he would only spare my boy." Heinrich's voice cracked slightly. "But God took him anyway. I buried my son on a Monday morning, and by Monday evening, I had sold everything I owned, given the money to the church, and joined a group of flagellants who were passing through the city." "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked. "Every moment," Heinrich said simply. "And not at all. This life is agony, but it is an agony with purpose, with meaning. When I was watching my family die, when I was burying them one by one, I felt completely powerless. I felt that nothing I did mattered, that all my prayers and pleas were falling on deaf ears. But this," he gestured to his scarred back, to the sleeping forms of the other flagellants, "this feels like I'm doing something. Maybe I'm fooling myself. Maybe we're all mad with grief and doing useless penance that accomplishes nothing. But maybe, just maybe, we're saving souls. Maybe our suffering means that someone else's child will survive. Maybe our blood is washing away the sins that brought this plague. I have to believe that. If I don't believe that, then I have nothing left." Thomas understood. That was exactly why he had come here, why he had left the monastery, why he had taken up the scourge. He needed to believe that suffering could be redemptive, that pain could have purpose, that Edmund's death and all the other deaths were part of some larger plan that human minds could barely glimpse. "Tell me honestly," Thomas said, "do you really believe God sent the plague to punish humanity for its sins?" Heinrich was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, uncertain in a way it had not been before. "I don't know what I believe about that. The priests say yes, God is angry with us. But I look at who dies, innocent children, holy monks like you, good simple people who never harmed anyone. And I wonder what sins they could have committed that deserved such punishment. And I look at who sometimes survives, cruel men, greedy merchants, corrupt clergy, and I wonder why God would spare them and take the innocent." "Then why do this?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "Why flagellate yourself if you're not sure it's what God wants?" "Because I need to believe that human beings have some control, some power to change our fate," Heinrich said. "If the plague is random, if it strikes without reason or purpose, if we're all just victims of bad air or planetary alignments, or whatever the physicians claim, then life is meaningless. We suffer and die for no reason, and nothing we do matters. But if the plague is divine punishment, then at least we can respond. We can repent. We can change. We can hope that our actions might make a difference. The flagellation, it's not really about changing God's mind. It's about changing our own. It's about refusing to be passive victims. It's about asserting that we are moral agents, that our choices matter, that we can participate in our own salvation." Thomas found this answer strangely comforting. He realized that he didn't have to be certain about God's purposes to find meaning in what he was doing. The act itself, the choice to suffer voluntarily, to offer up pain as a prayer, to stand against meaningless death with meaningful sacrifice, that was enough. They remained in Canterbury for 2 more days, performing their processions at the appointed hours. Thomas's back began to heal slightly between sessions, only to be torn open again with each new round of flagellation. The pain never lessened. If anything, it grew worse as his flesh became more tender, more raw. But he found himself adapting to it, learning to breathe through the worst moments, to let his mind drift away from his body during the scourging, to find a strange peace in the midst of agony. On the 3rd day, a messenger arrived from the local bishop, ordering the Flagellants to disperse immediately or face arrest for heresy. Heinrich gathered the group and announced they would leave that very hour, heading north toward London. Thomas felt a flutter of anxiety at this. London was enormous, far larger than Canterbury, and he had heard that the plague had struck there with particular ferocity. But he was committed now to this path, and he would follow wherever it led. They walked through the winter landscape, a ragged procession of penitents moving along roads that had seen countless refugees fleeing the plague. They passed abandoned villages where no smoke rose from the chimneys, where doors stood open, and no living soul remained. They passed mass graves, long trenches filled with bodies wrapped in shrouds, or sometimes not even wrapped, simply tumbled into the earth like refuse. The smell of death hung over the countryside, even in the cold that should have preserved things. In each village they passed that still had living inhabitants, they stopped to perform their penance. Word of their coming spread ahead of them, and people would gather to watch, their faces hollow with suffering and fear. Sometimes the village priest would come out to denounce them. Sometimes the priest would join them in prayer, setting aside theological concerns in the face of such overwhelming catastrophe. Sometimes there was no priest at all, the man having fled or died, leaving the villagers to fend for themselves spiritually as well as physically. Thomas met the other members of the group as they traveled. There was John, a former soldier who had fought in France and returned home to find his entire family dead. There was William, a baker whose shop had burned down during the chaos of the plague, who had nothing left and nowhere to go. There was Richard, a former clerk who had worked for a nobleman, now dead, leaving Richard without employment or prospects. There was Martin, a farmer whose land lay fallow because there was no one left to work it. They were all refugees in their own way, men whose lives had been shattered by the plague, who had turned to this extreme form of penance as a way to cope with loss and helplessness. Thomas felt a deep kinship with them, a bond forged not just by shared suffering, but by shared understanding of what that suffering meant. One evening, as they camped in the ruins of an abandoned monastery, Thomas sat with Peter and John, sharing a meager meal of bread and weak ale that a sympathetic villager had given them. The monastery had clearly been prosperous once, with fine stone buildings and what had probably been beautiful gardens. Now the buildings were empty, stripped of anything valuable by looters, and the gardens had gone wild with winter weeds poking through the snow. "What do you think happened to the monks here?" Peter wondered aloud, looking at the empty dormitory building. "Dead most likely," John said matter-of-factly. The soldier had a blunt way of speaking that could seem harsh, but was really just honest. "Or fled. Can't blame them if they ran. Staying in one place during the plague is like waiting for death to find you." "But we're monks," Thomas said quietly. "We take vows of stability, to remain in our communities, to stay faithful to our calling even in difficulty." "You left," John pointed out, not unkindly. "I did," Thomas admitted. "And I still don't know if that was the right choice. Prior Walter would say I'm an oath breaker, a deserter. Maybe he's right. Prior Walter is sitting safe in his monastery, while you're out here bleeding for God and humanity," Peter said. "Let him judge if he wants. God sees what's in your heart." But did he? Thomas wondered. What was in his heart? Faith, a fear, a grief, a madness. All of these things tangled together, impossible to separate. He thought of Edmund constantly, imagined conversations with his dead friend, wondering what Edmund would think of what Thomas was doing. Would he approve? Would he understand? Or would he, like Prior Walter, see it as misguided fanaticism? They reached London on a gray January morning when freezing rain was falling, turning the snow to slush and making the roads treacherous. The city rose before them, vast and sprawling, church spires and guild halls and countless houses packed together within the ancient walls. But as they drew closer, Thomas could see that something was wrong. There was smoke, too much smoke, the black smoke of burning that spoke of destruction rather than hearth fires. And the gates stood open, unguarded, which should never have been the case for a city of London's importance. Heinrich led them through the gates cautiously. The streets were eerily quiet, with far fewer people than there should have been in a city of this size. Those few people who were about moved quickly, fearfully, avoiding eye contact. Many wore clothes tied over their faces, as if that might ward off the plague. The air itself smelled wrong, smoke and rot and something else, something sweet and terrible that Thomas had come to recognize as the smell of mass death. They made their way to the square before St. Paul's Cathedral, intending to perform their first procession there. But as they entered the square, Thomas stopped in shock at what he saw. Bodies, dozens of them, laid out in rows, awaiting burial. Some were wrapped in shrouds. Many were not. Men, women, children, all ages, all conditions of life, united in death. And more were being brought even as they watched, carts pulling up with their terrible cargo, men with clothes tied over their faces, hurriedly unloading the dead and departing as quickly as possible. A priest stood near the cathedral doors, looking exhausted beyond measure. His vestments were stained and torn, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who had seen too much horror. When he saw the Flagellants, he didn't even have the energy to condemn them. "If you've come to help, we need people to dig graves," he said wearily. "If you've come to make trouble, I haven't the strength to stop you. Do what you will." Heinrich approached him respectfully. "Father, we've come to offer penance for the sins that have brought this plague upon us. With your permission, we'll perform our devotions here, in the shadow of this great cathedral." The priest looked at Heinrich's scarred back, visible where his cloak had fallen open, and something flickered in his dead eyes. Perhaps pity, perhaps understanding, perhaps simple exhaustion. "Penance," he said softly. "Yes, perhaps that's what's needed. God knows prayers alone seem to accomplish nothing. Do as you will. I'll not hinder you." They formed their procession in the square, among the dead. It felt appropriate somehow, performing their penance surrounded by those the plague had claimed, offering their blood for the souls of those who could no longer pray for themselves. Heinrich began the hymn, and the Flagellants took up their scourges. But this time was different. As they began to strike themselves, as their blood began to flow, people emerged from houses and churches, drawn by the sound. They came slowly at first, fearfully, but then in greater numbers. They came and they knelt in the wet slush, not caring that the cold water soaked through their clothes. They wept openly. They prayed aloud. Some began to strike their own chests in penance, crying out their sins, begging God for mercy. An old woman crawled forward on her knees, reaching out to touch the hem of Heinrich's cloak. "Pray for my grandson," she begged. "He's sick. He's only 6 years old. Please pray for him." Heinrich paused in his scourging, blood running down his back, and placed his hand on the woman's head in blessing. "We pray for him. We pray for all the suffering. May God have mercy." More people pressed forward, touching the Flagellants, begging for prayers, for blessings, for some sign that God still heard their desperate pleas. Thomas found himself surrounded by people: a merchant whose wife had died, a mother whose baby was sick, a young man who had lost his entire family and wanted to know why he alone had been spared. They looked at him with such hope, such desperate faith, that he felt crushed by the weight of their expectations. What could he offer them? He was just Thomas Carpenter, a failed monk, a grief-stricken young man who was trying to make sense of senseless tragedy. He had no special wisdom, no direct line to God's intentions, no power to heal or save. But he could pray. So he prayed with them, his voice hoarse, his back screaming with pain, his whole body shaking from cold and exhaustion. He prayed for the sick and the dying, for the dead and those who mourned them, for an end to the plague, for God's mercy on a suffering world. And as he prayed, he felt something shift inside him. This was what Edmund had meant, what he had asked for. Not to understand the suffering, that might be impossible, but to witness it, to stand with those who suffered, to refuse to turn away from their pain even when his own pain was overwhelming. They remained in London for a week, longer than Heinrich had planned, because the need was so great. Each day they performed their 3 processions, and each day the crowds grew larger. Some people joined them in flagellation, fashioning crude scourges and adding their blood to the offering. The church authorities sent representatives to order them to stop, but the representatives took one look at the desperate crowds and wisely decided not to press the issue. What harm were the Flagellants doing, really, compared to the harm the plague itself was doing? If they gave people hope, however false it might be, perhaps that was enough. Thomas worked alongside the others between processions, helping to dig graves, to comfort the dying, to bring food to those too sick or frightened to leave their homes. He saw things during that week that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A mother dead with her infant still clutched to her breast, both cold and stiff. A young bride, married only days before, dying in agony while her new husband wept helplessly beside her. An entire household dead, from the elderly grandfather to the youngest child, all struck down within days of each other. But he also saw remarkable things. He saw neighbors caring for neighbors, strangers taking in orphaned children, physicians staying at their posts even when their remedies failed, priests administering last rites knowing they risked infection. He saw humanity at its worst and its best, sometimes in the same moment. The plague stripped away all pretense, all social niceties, leaving only the raw essence of human nature. And that essence was complex, contradictory, capable of both terrible selfishness and astounding compassion. One afternoon, Thomas was bringing water to the sick in a makeshift hospital set up in a guild hall when he encountered a woman about his mother's age. She was caring for a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, who was clearly in the final stages of the plague. The woman's face was worn with exhaustion, and Thomas could see the telltale swellings in her own neck that meant she, too, was infected. "Is this your daughter?" Thomas asked gently as he set down his bucket of water. The woman shook her head. "I found her in the street 3 days ago. Her parents were already dead. She was trying to wake them and didn't understand why they wouldn't respond. I couldn't just leave her there, even though I knew. Even though taking her in meant," she gestured to her own neck, to the swellings that would soon kill her. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You showed her mercy in her final days. That's no small thing." "Will God think so?" the woman asked, and there was real uncertainty in her voice. "The priests say this plague is God's punishment. They say we're all sinners who deserve to die." But what did she do? She looked down at the girl, whose breathing was labored and painful. What sin could a child commit that would deserve this? It was the same question Thomas had asked himself 100 times, the same question that had no good answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't understand God's purposes in this. But I know that what you did, taking in this child, caring for her, giving her comfort in her final days, that was an act of love. And love is from God. So even in the midst of this horror, even in the midst of death, God is present through your actions." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I hope you're right. I hope God sees. I hope it matters." "It matters," Thomas said firmly, though he wasn't sure he entirely believed it himself. But he wanted to believe it. He needed to believe that human kindness mattered, that compassion mattered, that love mattered, even when death seemed to render everything meaningless. The girl died that evening, and the woman died 2 days later. Thomas helped bury them both in the mass grave, outside the city walls. There were so many bodies that individual graves were impossible. They were laid in rows, sometimes without even shrouds, and covered with quicklime and earth. Thomas said prayers over them, committed their souls to God's keeping, and tried not to think about the fact that they would lie in anonymous earth, unmarked, their names forgotten by all but God. It was after this, after watching that kind woman and the child she had tried to save both die, that Thomas had his first real crisis of faith. That night, as the Flagellants camped in an abandoned warehouse, he found himself unable to sleep, plagued by doubts that refused to be silenced. He had left the monastery, believing that God wanted more from humanity, that voluntary suffering could somehow atone for sin and end the plague. But the plague continued. People still died by the hundreds, by the thousands. His blood, Heinrich's blood, all their combined suffering, it seemed to change nothing. He slipped out of the warehouse and walked through the dark streets of London, not caring that it was dangerous, not caring about anything except the questions burning in his mind. What if the church was right and the flagellants were wrong? What if this suffering was pointless? What if God wasn't listening, or worse, didn't care? What if the plague was simply a disease, a natural phenomenon with no moral significance, and all their prayers and penances were just desperate humans trying to impose meaning on meaningless tragedy? He found himself at the river Thames, staring at the black water flowing past. How easy it would be to just walk into that water, to let the cold claim him, to end his doubt and pain and grief. Edmund was gone. His old life was gone. He was achieving nothing with the Flagellants, except adding his own suffering to the world's already overwhelming burden of pain. "You're thinking of ending it." The voice came from behind him, and Thomas turned to see Heinrich standing there, wrapped in his cloak against the cold. "I can see it in the way you're standing, the way you're looking at the water. I've seen that look before, on other men's faces. Sometimes they go through with it." Thomas didn't deny it. "What's the point of continuing? We're not helping. People still die. The plague still spreads. All we're doing is hurting ourselves for no reason." Heinrich came to stand beside him, both of them looking out at the dark water. "You're right," the German said quietly. "We probably are achieving nothing. The plague will run its course regardless of what we do. God's purposes, if he has purposes in this, are beyond our understanding or influence. We're like ants trying to comprehend human affairs. It's absurd, really, to think that our little ritual of self-flagellation could affect the course of divine judgment or natural disaster." Thomas looked at him in surprise. This was not what he had expected to hear from the fervent leader of the Flagellants. "Then why do you do it? Why do you continue?" "Because the alternative is despair," Heinrich said simply. "Because human beings need to feel that we have some agency, some power to respond to suffering, even if that response is ultimately futile. Because the act of choosing to suffer, of offering up pain voluntarily, is itself a declaration of meaning. We're saying that we are moral creatures, that our actions matter, that we refuse to be passive victims of fate. Maybe that's all religion really is. Humanity's refusal to accept meaninglessness, even when meaninglessness seems to be the truth of existence." "That sounds almost like heresy," Thomas said. Heinrich smiled slightly. "Perhaps it is. The church would certainly say so. The church claims to have all the answers, to know God's will with certainty. But I've found that certainty is usually just arrogance disguised as faith. True faith, I think, is continuing to believe and act even in the absence of certainty, even in the face of evidence that nothing we do matters. True faith is choosing meaning, even when meaning seems impossible." Thomas thought about this, watching the river flow past in the darkness. The woman who cared for that dying child, she knew it would kill her, but she did it anyway. Was that faith? "Yes," Heinrich said. "That was faith of the highest order. Not faith that God would save her, or that her actions would change the outcome, but faith that love and compassion matter regardless of outcome. That's what we're doing, really, with our flagellation. We're declaring that repentance matters, that penance matters, that the human soul matters, even if, especially if, we can't prove any of it. Edmund asked me to make sense of the suffering, Thomas said quietly. My friend who died. He asked me to ensure that all these deaths weren't meaningless. But I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to make sense of a world where good people die and bad people survive, where innocent children suffer, where a plague kills without reason or justice. Maybe you can't make sense of it, Heinrich suggested. Maybe the suffering is genuinely senseless, and any attempt to find meaning in it is just a comforting lie we tell ourselves. But even if that's true, we can still choose how we respond. We can respond with despair and surrender, or we can respond with defiance and compassion. We can give up, or we can continue to love and serve and sacrifice, even knowing it may be futile. That choice, that's where human dignity lies. Not in understanding suffering, but in how we face it. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, some tight knot of despair beginning to unravel. He realized that he had been looking for certainty, for assurance that his suffering had purpose, that Edmund's death meant something, that God had a plan. But maybe certainty wasn't possible. Maybe all he could do was choose, moment by moment, to act with love and courage even in the face of meaninglessness. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Thank you, he said to Heinrich. I think I can continue now. Good, Heinrich said. Because tomorrow we leave for the north, and the road will be hard. We'll face cold and hunger and danger. More of us will likely die before this is over. But we'll face it together, and we'll face it with purpose, even if that purpose is one we've created ourselves rather than received from on high. They returned to the warehouse, and Thomas slept more peacefully than he had in weeks. He dreamed of Edmund, but this time the dream was not painful. In the dream, Edmund was smiling and he said simply, "You're doing well, Thomas. Keep going." When Thomas woke, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. They left London the next morning, heading north through the Midlands. The weather grew even colder, and Thomas's feet were constantly numb despite the rags he wrapped around them. His back was a mass of scars now, old wounds layered over older ones, and he wondered if he would carry these marks for the rest of his life, however long that might be. They were like a map of his journey, a physical record of his attempt to make meaning from tragedy. They passed through Hertford and Bedford, through Northampton and Leicester, performing their processions in each town, drawing crowds of the desperate and the faithful. In some places, they were welcomed. In others, they were driven out by local authorities who feared that crowds of any kind would spread the plague further. In one village, they were attacked by a mob who blamed them for bringing the plague with them, as if the plague needed human carriers, as if it wasn't already everywhere, claiming victims regardless of what anyone did. Thomas was struck in the head by a thrown stone during that attack, and he bore a scar on his temple for the rest of his life. but even that violence seemed fitting somehow. Another mark of his journey, another reminder that good intentions were no protection against a world that had gone mad with fear and grief. It was in late February, as they approached the city of York, that Thomas fell ill. It started with a headache and chill, symptoms he tried to ignore, telling himself it was just exhaustion, just the cold, just the accumulation of weeks of deprivation and pain. But by evening, he was burning with fever, and by morning, he could feel the telltale swellings in his neck and armpits. He had the plague. He told no one at first, terrified that he would be abandoned, left to die alone by the roadside. But Heinrich noticed, of course. The German had sharp eyes and had seen too many cases of the plague not to recognize the signs. He pulled Thomas aside as the group prepared for their morning procession. "You're sick," Heinrich said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded, too weak to lie. "I don't want to be left behind." "We won't leave you," Heinrich said firmly. "But you can't continue with the processions. You need rest, care, medicine if we can find any." "There is no medicine," Thomas said bitterly. "You know that. Everyone who gets this dies. I've watched hundreds die. Now it's my turn." "Not everyone dies," Heinrich corrected. "Some survive. I've seen it. You're young and strong. You have a chance." But Thomas didn't feel young or strong. He felt ancient, exhausted beyond words, ready for this struggle to end. Part of him was almost relieved. He had done his penance, had offered his suffering, had tried to make meaning from Edmund's death and all the other deaths. If God wanted to take him now, he was ready. They made camp in an abandoned farm outside York, and the other Flagellants took turns caring for Thomas. Peter sat with him through the first terrible night, bringing water when the fever made him desperately thirsty, holding him when the chills made him shake so hard he thought his bones would break. John, the soldier, used his practical skills to make a more comfortable pallet for Thomas to lie on, gathering straw and finding an old blanket to cover him. The fever dreams came on the second night, vivid and terrible. Thomas found himself back in the monastery, but it was wrong somehow. The walls were bleeding, and the chapel was filled with corpses instead of monks. He searched desperately for Edmund, calling his name through endless corridors, but all he found were bodies, more and more bodies, piled so high they blocked the doors and windows. Then he was in his childhood home, and his mother was there. But when she turned to face him, her eyes were black voids and her skin was covered in plague sores. He woke up screaming and found Heinrich sitting beside him, holding a cool cloth to his burning forehead. "Easy, brother," Heinrich said softly. "You're dreaming. You're safe." "Safe," Thomas laughed bitterly, the sound turning into a cough that racked his whole body. "No one is safe. Death is everywhere." "Yes," Heinrich agreed. "Death is everywhere. But so is life, still clinging on, still fighting." "You're fighting, Thomas. I can see it. Your body is strong, your will is strong. Don't give up yet." But as the days passed, Thomas felt himself slipping away. The fever wouldn't break. The swellings in his neck and armpits grew larger, more painful. He could barely eat, could barely drink. Time became fluid, meaningless. Sometimes he thought he was back in Canterbury, caring for Edmund. Sometimes he thought he was a child again, helping his father in the workshop. Sometimes he knew where he was, lying in a drafty barn while the plague consumed him. But that reality seemed no more real than the dreams. On the fourth day, he heard voices arguing nearby. Through the haze of fever, he recognized Heinrich and someone else, a woman. "He'll die if you move him," the woman was saying. "He's too weak to travel." "We can't stay here indefinitely," Heinrich replied. "The authorities in York know we're here. They've sent word that if we enter the city, we'll be arrested. We need to move on, go around the city and continue north." "Then go," the woman said. "Leave him with me. I'll care for him. We don't abandon our brothers." "You're not abandoning him. You're leaving him in capable hands. I'm a healer. I've treated plague victims before. A few have even survived. I can give him a better chance than he'll have bouncing around in a cart on frozen roads." There was a long pause. Then Heinrich said, "Who are you? Why would you do this for a stranger?" "My name is Margaret," the woman said. "And I do this because someone needs to. God knows there's been enough death. If I can save even one life, perhaps it will balance the scales a little." Thomas wanted to protest, to tell them not to leave him with a stranger, but he couldn't find the strength to speak. He heard footsteps approaching, and then a cool hand was on his forehead, and a woman's face swam into view above him. She was perhaps 35 years old, with strong, capable features and eyes that held both sadness and determination. "Rest now," Margaret said to him. "Save your strength for healing." He must have lost consciousness then, because the next thing he knew, it was dark and he was alone except for Margaret, who sat beside him in the dim light of a single candle. The other flagellants were gone. He could hear wind howling outside and snow pattering against the barn walls. "They left," he managed to whisper. "They did," Margaret confirmed. "But Heinrich blessed you before he went, and he promised to pray for your recovery. And Peter left you this." She held up the small wooden cross that Thomas's mother had given him, the one he had carried from the monastery. "It fell from your belongings, and Peter made sure I knew it was precious to you." Thomas felt tears sliding down his face, though he wasn't sure if they were from grief or gratitude or simply fever. He tried to ask Margaret about herself, about why she was here in this abandoned barn, about why she would risk infection to care for a dying flagellant. But the effort of speaking exhausted him, and he drifted back into feverish darkness. For days, he lost count of how many. He existed in a twilight state between life and death. Sometimes he was lucid enough to be aware of Margaret caring for him, bringing water and weak broth, cleaning his wounds, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. Sometimes he was lost in fever dreams, reliving moments from his past, conversing with the dead, experiencing visions that seemed more real than reality. In one particularly vivid dream, he stood in a vast field covered with snow, and all around him were people, thousands of them, perhaps millions, all marked by the plague, all dying or dead. And Edmund was there, looking exactly as he had in life, healthy and whole and smiling. "Why did you die?" Thomas asked him in the dream. "Why did God take you?" "Maybe God didn't take me," Edmund replied. "Maybe I just died, Thomas. Maybe it wasn't punishment or purpose or plan. Maybe it was just a disease, and I was unlucky." "But then what's the point?" Thomas cried. "If there's no reason, no meaning, then why go on? Why struggle?" Edmund's smile grew wider, more radiant. "Because meaning isn't something you find, Thomas. It's something you create. You make meaning through your choices, through your actions, through how you love and serve and sacrifice. I died of plague, but that doesn't make my life meaningless. I mattered because I loved, because I was loved, because I made a difference to the people around me, to you especially. And you're making meaning now, through your suffering, through your attempt to help others, through your refusal to give up even when giving up would be easier. That's enough. That has to be enough. I miss you," Thomas whispered in the dream. "I know," Edmund said gently. "And you'll carry that grief for the rest of your life. But grief is just love with nowhere to go. Keep loving, Thomas. Keep caring. Keep making meaning. That's how you honor the dead, by continuing to live, to really live with purpose and compassion." Thomas woke from that dream with tears streaming down his face, but for the first time since falling ill, the fever had broken. He was weak, desperately weak, but his mind was clear. He looked around the barn and saw that gray morning light was filtering through the cracks in the walls. Margaret sat nearby, her head bowed in sleep or prayer, exhausted from her vigil. "Margaret," he croaked, his voice barely audible. She jerked awake immediately, and when she saw him looking at her with clear eyes, her face broke into a smile of relief. "Your fever broke," she said, coming to kneel beside him. "Thank God. I was beginning to fear." "How long?" Thomas asked. 10 days since the Flagellants left you with me. 12 since you first fell ill, I think. I won't lie to you. There were moments when I thought you wouldn't make it. The fever was so high. The swellings were so large. But something in you fought back. Your body is strong, Thomas. Stronger than you knew." Thomas tried to sit up, but the effort made his head swim, and Margaret gently pushed him back down. "Not yet," she said firmly. "You need to recover your strength gradually. You've been to the very edge of death. Coming back will take time." Over the following days, Thomas slowly regained his strength. Margaret fed him carefully, starting with broth and gradually introducing more solid foods as his stomach could handle them. She told him her story as he recovered, perhaps sensing that he needed distraction from his own thoughts. She had been married to a wool merchant in York, a good man named Robert who had treated her with kindness and respect. They had been blessed with 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Margaret had learned the healing arts from her mother, who had been a midwife and herb woman, and she had used those skills to help neighbors and friends when they were ill or injured. Her life had been comfortable, secure, and happy. Then the plague came to York. Her daughter died first, then her younger son. Her husband Robert and their older son Henry both fell ill at the same time. Margaret had nursed them desperately, using every remedy she knew, praying every prayer she could remember. Robert had died after 5 days. But Henry had survived. He had been one of the rare ones who pulled through, who recovered from the plague and lived. "I thought we'd been spared the worst," Margaret said, her voice distant with memory. "I thought Henry and I would rebuild our lives together. He was 17, old enough to take over his father's business, young enough to marry and give me grandchildren someday. We had survived the plague. We had a future." She paused, and Thomas could see the pain in her eyes even before she continued. 2 weeks after he recovered from the plague, Henry went down to the river to help some men who were trying to rescue goods from a capsized boat. The current was strong from spring melt, and the water was freezing. Henry slipped, fell in, and drowned. They found his body a mile downstream. Thomas felt his throat tighten. To survive the plague, only to die in such a meaningless accident, it seemed impossibly cruel. "I'm so sorry," he said inadequately. Margaret nodded, accepting his sympathy. "After Henry's death, I couldn't stay in York. Everything there reminded me of what I'd lost. I sold the house, the business, everything. I gave most of the money to the church, for masses for my family's souls, and I kept only enough to live on simply. I've been traveling since then, going from village to village, helping where I can. Treating the sick, delivering bobbies, tending to the dying. It's the only thing that gives me purpose now." "You saved my life," Thomas said quietly. "Why?" "Because I couldn't save my own family," Margaret replied honestly. "Because every person I help to heal, every life I preserve, feels like a small victory against the death that has taken so much from me. I can't bring back my husband, my children. But I can keep fighting death, keep defying it, keep pulling people back from its grasp when I can. It's not much, but it's something." Thomas understood completely. That was exactly what he had been trying to do with the Flagellants, in his own way, to fight back against meaningless death by creating meaning through suffering and sacrifice. Margaret was doing the same thing through healing and service. Different paths, but the same fundamental human need to assert purpose in the face of chaos. As Thomas continued to recover, Margaret taught him some of her healing knowledge. She showed him which herbs could help with fever, which poultices could draw out infection, which teas could ease pain. She taught him how to recognize the signs of different illnesses, how to judge whether a patient would likely survive or die, how to bring comfort even when cure was impossible. "The most important thing," she told him one afternoon as they prepared medicines together, "is simply to be present with the suffering." Most of what we do as healers is actually useless. The body heals itself or it doesn't, and our interventions make little difference. But presence makes a difference. Compassion makes a difference. Not leaving people to die alone in fear, that makes a difference. Thomas thought about this as he ground herbs in a mortar. Presence, compassion, not leaving people alone. That was what the Flagellants had done in London, really. Yes, they had performed their dramatic rituals of self-flagellation, but the real impact had been in standing with the suffering, being present in the midst of horror, refusing to flee or turn away. Maybe that was the true meaning of what they were doing, not changing God's mind or ending the plague through penance, but simply bearing witness to suffering and saying, "You are not alone. We see you. We stand with you." After 3 weeks with Margaret, Thomas was strong enough to travel. The swellings had gone down completely, leaving only scars. His fever had not returned. He had survived the plague. He was one of the fortunate minority who recovered, and according to what physicians claimed, would never catch it again. He bore the marks of both his flagellation and his illness. His body, a map of suffering, endured and survived. The question was, what now? "You could stay with me," Margaret offered as they discussed his plans. "I could use a partner in this work. You have a gentle touch with the sick, and you're learning the healing arts quickly. We could travel together, helping where we're needed." It was tempting. Thomas had found peace with Margaret, had discovered a new sense of purpose in healing rather than self-harm. And he cared for her. She had saved his life and taught him so much. But he felt unfinished business pulling at him, a sense that his journey with the Flagellants was not yet complete. "I need to find them," he said finally. "Heinrich and the others. I need to know if they're still alive, still pursuing their mission. I made a commitment when I joined them, and I feel I should honor that commitment, at least to say farewell properly if I'm going to leave their company." Margaret nodded understandingly. "I thought you might say that." "Very well. They were heading north when they left you, planning to go through Durham and on towards Scotland. If you follow the Great North Road, you'll likely hear news of them. A group of Flagellants is hard to miss." Thomas prepared to leave the next morning. Margaret gave him supplies, food, a better cloak, herbs for healing, and a small amount of money. She also gave him something else, a sense of hope, a new perspective on how to make meaning from suffering. Before he left, he asked her, "Will you be all right? Traveling alone, I mean." She smiled. "I've been alone for 2 years now. I've learned to manage. And besides, I'm not really alone. There are always people who need help, always someone to care for. That's enough for me." They embraced, and Thomas set off northward, following the road that the Flagellants had taken weeks before. His feet were no longer bare. Margaret had insisted he take proper boots, and he carried a walking staff she had given him. He felt different than he had when he first joined the Flagellants. Less certain about absolute truths, perhaps, but more certain about what mattered. Compassion, presence, the refusal to let suffering be the final word. He traveled for days, through villages still scarred by plague, past churches where fresh graves multiplied in the churchyards, through countryside that should have been bustling with spring planting but lay silent and abandoned. He asked after the Flagellants in each village, and sometimes people remembered them passing through, sometimes not. The trail grew cold as he moved further north. It was in a small village called Darlington that he finally found news of them. The village priest, a weary man named Father Benedict, remembered the Flagellants well. "They came through here about 3 weeks ago," Father Benedict said. "Performed their processions, drew quite a crowd. But there was trouble." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of trouble?" "The bishop sent soldiers to arrest them. There was a confrontation. Some of the Flagellants fled. Others were taken into custody. I don't know what became of them. They were taken to Durham for trial, I believe. The church does not look kindly on those who practice penance without ecclesiastical authority." "Do you know which ones were arrested?" Thomas asked urgently. "Was there a German man named Heinrich? A young man named Peter?" Father Benedict shook his head. "I don't recall individual names. It was chaotic. There was shouting, some fighting. Several Flagellants were wounded in the scuffle. Some escaped into the countryside. I'm sorry I can't tell you more." Thomas thanked him and continued north toward Durham, his heart heavy with worry. He had abandoned the Flagellants. No, that wasn't fair. He had been dying and they had left him with a healer who saved his life. But he felt guilty nonetheless. While he had been recovering in Margaret's care, his brothers had faced arrest and violence. He reached Durham after 2 days of hard travel. The cathedral rose above the city, magnificent and imposing, a statement of the church's power and authority. Thomas made his way to the castle, where he learned that several Flagellants were indeed being held, awaiting trial for heresy. He asked to see them, claiming to be a monk of Canterbury who had known some of the prisoners. The guards were skeptical, but his tonsure, which was growing out but still visible, and his educated speech convinced them. They led him down into the castle's dungeons, into the cold stone chambers where prisoners were kept. He found them in a large cell, 8 men huddled together for warmth on the damp stone floor. Heinrich was there, and Thomas's heart leaped with relief. So were Peter and John, and several others he recognized. They looked haggard, underfed, and some bore bruises and wounds from their arrest, but they were alive. "Thomas," Peter cried out when he saw him, rushing to the bars. "You're alive. We feared you had died." "I nearly did," Thomas admitted, gripping Peter's hands through the bars. "But a healer named Margaret saved my life. I've been recovering for weeks. What happened to you? Are you all right?" Heinrich came forward, and Thomas could see that the German had been beaten. His face was bruised, and he moved stiffly as if his ribs pained him. But his eyes still burned with that intense conviction. "They call us heretics," Heinrich said with a bitter smile. They say we usurp the church's authority over penance, that we mislead the faithful, that we cause public disorder. We'll be tried within the week, and unless I'm much mistaken, we'll be found guilty and handed over to the secular authorities for punishment. Punishment means what? Thomas asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Death most likely, John said pragmatically. Or at minimum, public flogging and imprisonment. The church is cracking down on flagellant movements across Europe. They fear we represent a challenge to ecclesiastical authority, that we encourage people to seek salvation outside the church's control. They're probably right in a way. We do challenge their authority. We do claim that individual penance can reach God directly, without needing a priest as intermediary. Thomas felt despair washing over him. These men who had only been trying to make sense from tragedy, who had been trying to help others, who had suffered so much already, now they would die for it. It seemed unbearably unjust. There must be something I can do, Thomas said desperately. Some way to help you. I could speak on your behalf, testify to your good character. And land yourself in the cell next to us, Heinrich interrupted. No, Thomas. You've been given a second chance at life. Don't waste it by throwing yourself into our fate. You survived the plague for a reason. Go and live for that reason. Do good in the world. That's how you can honor us. But Thomas couldn't simply walk away. He spent the next several days in Durham, trying desperately to find some way to help his imprisoned brothers. He spoke to priests, to lawyers, to anyone who might have influence with the ecclesiastical court. He wrote a petition on behalf of the Flagellants, describing their good works in London, how they had comforted the dying and helped bury the dead, how their intentions had been pure even if their methods were unorthodox. Most people he approached were sympathetic but unhelpful. The church had made its decision about the flagellant movement. It was heretical and must be suppressed. Individual acts of charity didn't change the fundamental problem. These men were claiming a direct relationship with God that bypassed church authority, and that could not be tolerated. The trial was held in the cathedral itself, in a side chapel that had been converted into a courtroom. Thomas was allowed to attend as an observer. He sat in the back, watching as Heinrich and the others were brought forward in chains to face their accusers. The bishop himself presided, an elderly man named Thomas Hatfield who had a reputation for stern orthodoxy. The charges were read: heresy, false teaching, causing public disorder, practicing unauthorized penance, leading the faithful astray. Each charge was documented with testimony from priests in various towns where the Flagellants had performed their processions. Heinrich was permitted to speak in his own defense. He stood before the bishop, still in chains, his bruised face proud and unrepentant. "My Lord Bishop," he began, "we are accused of heresy, but I submit to you that our only crime is taking seriously the teachings of Christ. Did not our Lord say, 'If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me'? Did he not suffer on the cross for the sins of humanity? We seek only to imitate his suffering, to take upon ourselves a small portion of the pain that he endured for our sake. Christ's suffering was unique and redemptive, the bishop replied coldly. Your suffering is presumptuous and meaningless. You are not Christ. Your blood does not wash away sin. Only the sacraments of the Church, administered by properly ordained clergy, can offer forgiveness and salvation. By claiming that your self-inflicted wounds have spiritual value, you undermine the entire sacramental system that Christ established through his Church. But surely voluntary penance has always been part of Christian practice, Heinrich argued. Monks fast and deprive themselves. Hermits live in harsh conditions to grow closer to God. How is what we do fundamentally different? The difference, the bishop said, is that monks and hermits practice their austerities under the guidance and authority of the Church, as part of established religious orders with approved rules. You are laymen acting on your own authority, performing public spectacles that draw attention to yourselves rather than to God. You encourage others to follow your example, leading them away from proper submission to church teaching. This is the very definition of heresy, setting up your own judgment above that of the church that Christ founded. The trial continued for hours, with theological arguments back and forth, but the outcome was never in doubt. By evening, the bishop pronounced his verdict, guilty on all charges. The Flagellants were excommunicated from the church and handed over to the secular authorities for punishment. The sentence was to be carried out in 3 days' time, public flogging followed by life imprisonment. Thomas left the cathedral in despair. He walked through Durham streets as darkness fell, not knowing where he was going, not caring. He had failed. He had promised Edmund that the suffering wouldn't be meaningless, but there was more meaningless suffering. Good men being punished for trying to do good, for trying to find purpose in tragedy. He found himself at a small church on the outskirts of the city, its door standing open to the spring evening. He went inside and knelt before the altar, something he hadn't done since leaving Canterbury. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say to a God who seemed deaf to human suffering? What prayers could possibly matter in a world this broken? You look troubled, my son. Thomas looked up to see an old priest emerging from the shadows near the altar. He was very elderly, with a deeply lined face and kind eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow and wisdom. I am troubled, Father, Thomas admitted. I don't know how to pray anymore. I don't know if prayer means anything. The old priest settled himself on the altar steps with a soft grunt, gesturing for Thomas to sit beside him. I'm Father William, he said. I've been a priest of this church for 40 years. I've seen much in that time, wars, famines, and now this terrible plague. And I'll tell you a secret. I often don't know if prayer means anything either. Thomas looked at him in surprise. But you're a priest. Aren't you supposed to have faith? Aren't you supposed to be certain? Father William smiled. Who told you that faith and certainty are the same thing? I have faith, yes, but it's faith riddled with doubt, faith that struggles, faith that questions. I think that's the only honest kind of faith there is. The people who claim perfect certainty about gods are usually either fools or liars. Then why continue? Thomas asked. Why keep praying if you don't know if it matters? Why keep serving a God whose purposes are incomprehensible? Because what else is there? Father William replied simply. We're human beings. We need meaning, purpose, connection to something larger than ourselves. Religion provides that, however imperfectly. Yes, we might be wrong about everything. God might not exist, or might not care about humanity, or might have purposes so alien to our understanding that they're effectively meaningless to us. But the alternative, pure nihilism, the belief that nothing matters and life has no purpose, that's unlivable. Human beings can't function without meaning. So we create meaning through our beliefs and actions, through our rituals and prayers, through our attempts to connect with the divine. Even if it's all ultimately a beautiful fiction we've invented to make existence bearable, it's a necessary fiction. Thomas thought about this, remembering his conversation with Heinrich by the Thames, remembering Edmund's words in his fevered dream. Everyone seemed to be telling him the same thing. Meaning isn't found, it's created. Faith isn't certainty, it's choice. I have friends, Thomas said quietly. Good men who are going to be flogged and imprisoned for trying to make sense of the plague through voluntary suffering. The church calls them heretics. But they were only trying to help, trying to find some way to respond to all the death and meaninglessness. Father William nodded slowly. I heard about the Flagellant trial. I even attended part of it. And I'll be honest with you, the bishop is not wrong in his theological concerns. The Flagellants do represent a challenge to church authority. They do encourage a direct relationship with God that bypasses ecclesiastical mediation. From the church's perspective, that's dangerous, potentially heretical. But is the church's perspective the only one that matters? Thomas asked with some heat. What about compassion? What about mercy? These men have suffered terribly. They've lost families to the plague, lost everything. They found meaning in voluntary penance. Who is the church to say that their suffering is worthless? The church, Father William said carefully, is a human institution for all its claims to divine authority. It's run by human beings with human flaws, pride, fear, desire for control. Sometimes the church is wise and merciful. Sometimes it's rigid and cruel. Right now, faced with a plague it cannot control or explain, faced with a population that's terrified and desperate, the church is circling the wagons, reasserting its authority, crushing anything that challenges its control. Is that right? Perhaps not. But it's understandable, if not excusable. So my friends will suffer because of the church's fear, Thomas said bitterly. Unless someone intervenes, Father William said. Unless someone with influence decides to show mercy. Who would do that? The bishop has made his ruling. The bishop has made his ruling, Father William agreed. But the secular lord who must carry out the sentence has some discretion in how severely it's enforced. Lord Percy is a practical man, not particularly pious or interested in theological disputes. If someone could appeal to him, present the Flagellants as harmless religious enthusiasts rather than dangerous heretics, he might be persuaded to commute the sentence, perhaps exile instead of imprisonment. "Would you help?" Thomas asked, hopping to stir in his chest. "Would you speak to Lord Percy on their behalf?" Father William was quiet for a long moment. "I'm an old man," he said finally. "I've learned to pick my battles carefully. If I openly defy the bishop's wishes, I could lose my position, perhaps even face charges myself. At my age, I don't have the strength or courage for martyrdom." Thomas felt his hope dying. But then Father William continued, "However, I could arrange for you to meet with Lord Percy privately. I could introduce you as a concerned scholar, someone with knowledge of the flagellant movement who can provide context the bishop's court didn't consider. What you say to Lord Percy, how you plead your case, that would be up to you. But I could at least get you in the door." It wasn't much, but it was something. Thomas gripped the old priest's hand. "Thank you, Father. Thank you." The meeting was arranged for the following morning. Father William took Thomas to Lord Percy's manor house and introduced him as Brother Thomas, a Benedictine scholar with important information about the flagellant prisoners. Then he left, giving Thomas a meaningful look that said, "The rest is up to you." Lord Percy was a man of perhaps 50, with the weathered look of someone who had spent more time on battlefields than in manor houses. He received Thomas in his study, surrounded by maps and military correspondence, looking somewhat annoyed at this interruption to his mourning. "Father William says you have something important to tell me about the heretics," Lord Percy said without preamble. "Make it quick. I have a war to plan." Thomas hadn't prepared a speech. He simply spoke from his heart, telling Lord Percy about Heinrich's family dying in the plague, about Peter losing his entire family, about the kindness these men had shown in London when they helped care for the dying. He described the Flagellants not as dangerous heretics, but as grief-stricken men trying desperately to make sense of overwhelming tragedy. "They're not trying to overthrow the church," Thomas said earnestly. "They're just trying to survive their grief. They've chosen a strange way to do it, yes, but is it really so much stranger than becoming a hermit or joining a monastery? They're performing voluntary penance, offering their suffering to God. How is that heretical?" Lord Percy listened with a skeptical expression. "The bishop says they're dangerous, that they lead people astray." "The bishop is afraid," Thomas countered boldly. "The church is losing control because the plague makes a mockery of everything the church teaches about divine justice and protection. The faithful are desperate, looking for answers anywhere they can find them. The Flagellants offer one possible answer, that human beings have agency, that we can respond to suffering through voluntary sacrifice. Yes, that challenges church authority. But is it truly wrong? Is it truly evil? You make a compelling argument, Lord Percy said, but I'm not a theologian. The church says they're heretics, so as far as I'm concerned, they're heretics. However, he paused, studying Thomas carefully. I am a practical man. I'm about to march north to fight the Scots, and I haven't the men or resources to spare on guarding prisoners indefinitely. If these flagellants were to be exiled from English territory instead of imprisoned, that would solve my problem nicely. They'd be gone, unable to cause further trouble, but I wouldn't have to feed and house them for years. Thomas felt hope surging. Would you correct their sentences? Exile instead of imprisonment. I could, Lord Percy said slowly. But there's a condition. They must leave England immediately and swear never to return. And you, Brother Thomas, you must go with them to ensure they actually leave and don't simply regroup elsewhere in my territory. Can you agree to that? Exile. Thomas would never see England again, never see Canterbury or his family or the places of his childhood. But what did he have here anyway? His monastic life was over. His old life was gone. And Heinrich, Peter, John, these men had become his brothers more truly than the monks of Canterbury had ever been. I agree, Thomas said. The sentence was commuted that very day. Instead of flogging and imprisonment, the Flagellants were given 3 days to leave English territory, with Thomas assigned as their escort to ensure compliance. Lord Percy made it clear that if any of them ever returned to England, they would be arrested immediately, and the original sentence carried out in full. When Thomas brought the news to the prison, the Flagellants received it with mixed emotions. Heinrich looked thoughtful, Peter relieved, John pragmatic as always. Exile, Heinrich mused. Where will we go? Scotland. France. Back to the German lands where this all began. Does it matter? John said. We've been wandering for months already. We can wander just as well in Scotland or on the continent. What about you, Thomas? Peter asked. You're not one of us anymore. You didn't participate in the trial. You weren't sentenced. You could stay in England, return to your monastery, resume your old life. Why throw that away to accompany us into exile? Thomas thought about this. Why indeed? But as he considered the question, he realized he already knew the answer. Because you're my brothers, he said simply. Because I made a commitment when I joined you, and I want to honor that commitment. Because I've learned more about faith and meaning in these months with you than I learned in 7 years at the monastery. And because I don't have an old life to return to. That person who entered the monastery at 16, full of certainty and pious devotion, he died when Edmund died, or maybe when I took up the scourge, or maybe when I survived the plague. I'm someone different now, and I need to discover who that someone is. I think that discovery lies with you, wherever we end up going. Heinrich smiled, and for the first time since Thomas had known him, It was a smile of genuine warmth rather than fierce conviction. "Then welcome back, brother. We're glad to have you." They were released the next morning and given supplies for the journey: food, warm cloaks, a small amount of money. They set out immediately, heading north toward the Scottish border. Thomas walked with them, feeling strangely lighter than he had in months. He had made his choice. He had committed himself to this path, wherever it led. As they traveled, Thomas told them about his illness and recovery, about Margaret and what she had taught him about healing. The Flagellants listened with interest, and Peter asked thoughtful questions about herbal remedies and treatment methods. "You could teach us," Peter suggested. "We encounter sick and suffering people everywhere we go. If we had healing skills, we could do more than just pray for them. We could actually help." Thomas liked this idea. It felt like a way to combine what he had learned from the Flagellants with what he had learned from Margaret, serving others through both spiritual devotion and practical care. Over the following days, as they made their way north, he began teaching the others what Margaret had taught him about identifying helpful herbs, preparing medicines, treating common ailments. They crossed into Scotland in late April, as spring was finally beginning to assert itself over the lingering winter. The landscape was beautiful but harsh: rolling hills, rocky outcroppings, patches of forest interspersed with open moorland. They passed through villages that had been touched by the plague, but not as devastated as English settlements. The Scots, it seemed, had been somewhat spared the worst of the pestilence, though no place was entirely safe. At first, the Scottish villagers were suspicious of these strange English penitents, with their scarred backs and foreign ways. But when the Flagellants stopped to help a farmer whose barn had burned, when they assisted at a difficult childbirth using Thomas's newly acquired medical knowledge, when they spent hours sitting with a dying old woman who had no family to comfort her, gradually, suspicion turned to acceptance, even welcome. They established a pattern over the following months. They would arrive in a village and offer their services: medical care, help with hard labor, comfort for the suffering, prayers for the dead. In return, they asked only for food and shelter. They still performed their flagellation, but less publicly now, more as a private devotion than a public spectacle. The focus had shifted from dramatic displays of penance to quiet service. Heinrich seemed different, softer somehow. The fierce intensity that had driven him was still there, but tempered now with something gentler. One evening, as they camped in the hills overlooking a valley dotted with farms, Thomas asked him about this change. "I've been thinking," Heinrich said, "about what we've been doing, about whether it's accomplished anything. We set out to end the plague through voluntary suffering, through blood penance. But the plague hasn't ended. It still claims lives, still spreads, still causes suffering. So in that sense, we've failed." "But," Thomas prompted, sensing there was more. "But maybe that was never the real purpose," Heinrich continued. "Maybe the real purpose was what happened along the way, the people we helped in London, the comfort we brought to the dying, the way we stood with the suffering when others fled. Maybe the flagellation itself was never the point. Maybe it was just a way to process our own grief, to feel like we were doing something when we felt so helpless. But the real work, the real value of what we've been doing, it's in the service, the compassion, the refusal to let suffering go unwitnessed. Thomas nodded. Margaret told me something similar. She said the most important thing in healing isn't the medicines or treatments, but simply being present with people in their suffering, not leaving them alone. Yes, Heinrich said. Exactly. That's what we're called to do, not to understand suffering, not to fix it or end it, but to be present with it, to bear witness, to say, I see you, I'm with you, you matter. That's what love looks like in a plague-ridden world. They continued their wandering through Scotland, and gradually their group changed. Some of the original Flagellants left, finding new lives in Scottish villages, settling down with work or even marriage. New people joined, not as Flagellants particularly, but as companions in their mission of service. A young Scotsman named Angus attached himself to them after they saved his sister from a difficult fever. An elderly woman named Moira, who had healing knowledge even more extensive than Thomas's limited skills, traveled with them for several months, teaching them before her health failed, and she had to return to her daughter's household. By summer, they were less a band of Flagellants and more a group of traveling healers and helpers, moving from place to place, offering aid where it was needed. They still bore the scars of their flagellation. Those marks would be with them for life, but the practice itself became increasingly rare. It seemed less necessary now, less urgent. They had found other ways to make meaning from suffering. Thomas thought often of Edmund during these months, and of Margaret, and of his parents whom he would likely never see again. He wrote letters occasionally, when they passed through larger towns with the means to send messages south, though he had no way of knowing if those letters ever reached their destinations. In them, he tried to explain what he had learned, how his understanding of faith and suffering and meaning had evolved. In one letter to his mother, written on a precious piece of vellum he had purchased in Edinburgh, he wrote, "Dear Mother, if this letter reaches you, know that I am alive and well, though far from home. I have traveled a strange path since leaving Canterbury, one that has taken me through suffering and doubt to something I hesitate to call understanding, but perhaps acceptance. I have learned that faith is not certainty, but choice. The choice to create meaning even when meaning seems impossible. The choice to love even when love leads to loss. The choice to serve even when service seems futile. I think of you often and of Father, and I pray that you are safe and well. I do not know if I will ever return to England, but please know that the cross you gave me remains with me always, and that the love with which you gave it sustains me in dark moments. Your son, Thomas." He never received a reply, and he tried not to wonder too much about why. Perhaps the letter never arrived. Perhaps his parents were dead. The plague had been terrible in Kent. Perhaps they had disowned him for abandoning his monastic vows. He would likely never know. It was in early autumn, as they traveled through the highlands, that they encountered something unexpected. Another group of flagellants, these ones German, recently arrived from the continent. There were about 20 of them, led by a gaunt, wild-eyed man named Klaus, who reminded Thomas uncomfortably of what Heinrich had been like when they first met. All fierce conviction and no doubt, certain that God demanded blood and pain, that the plague would only end when humanity had suffered enough. Klaus and his followers had heard rumors of Heinrich's group and sought them out, expecting to find kindred spirits. Instead, they found something quite different. Former flagellants who now spent more time delivering bobbies and treating fevers than scourging themselves, who spoke of service and compassion rather than divine wrath and necessary penance. Klaus was appalled. "You've gone soft," he accused Heinrich when the two groups met in a village called Inverness. "You've forgotten your purpose. The plague still rages on the continent, whole cities dead, countless thousands dying every day. And you're here playing at being physicians. God doesn't want your herbs and remedies. God wants blood. God wants suffering. Only through penance can we appease his wrath." Heinrich listened patiently, and Thomas could see echoes of his former self in Klaus's words. But when Heinrich replied, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "I used to believe as you do," he said. "I used to think that God had sent the plague as punishment, that only through extreme penance could we earn forgiveness. But I've learned something in my travels. Suffering doesn't redeem anything. Suffering is just suffering. It doesn't make us holier or bring us closer to God. What brings us closer to God, if such a thing is even possible, is love, service, compassion, caring for others in their need. That's the real penance, if you want to call it that. Not hurting ourselves, but helping others." "Heresy," Klaus spat. "You've been corrupted by comfort, by the softness of this northern land where the plague is less severe. You've forgotten the horror, the death, the divine judgment." "I've forgotten nothing," Heinrich said, and for a moment his old fire returned. "I watched my wife and children die. I've seen horrors that will haunt me until my own death. But I've also seen extraordinary kindness, strangers caring for strangers, people sacrificing themselves for others, love persisting even in the midst of death. And I've come to believe that God, if God exists, if God cares about humanity at all, is more present in that kindness than in all the blood we spill through self-flagellation." The two groups parted ways the next morning, Klaus's flagellants heading south to England despite the risks, Heinrich's group continuing their wandering through Scotland. Thomas watched Klaus's group depart with a mixture of pity and relief. He recognized in Klaus the certainty he himself had once craved, the belief that suffering had a clear purpose, that pain could purchase salvation, that everything made sense if only one had faith enough. But he had moved beyond that now, into a more uncertain but more honest faith, one that admitted doubt and mystery but still chose love and service. As autumn deepened toward winter, Heinrich's health began to fail. He had never fully recovered from the beating he received at his arrest in Durham, and the years of deprivation and suffering had taken their toll on his body. He developed a cough that wouldn't go away, and he grew thinner and weaker despite eating whatever food they could provide. By October, it was clear he was dying. Not from plague, he had survived that years ago, but from simple exhaustion from a body worn out by suffering. They stopped their wandering and took shelter in a small monastery outside Glasgow, where the monks, moved by Heinrich's devotion and the group's reputation for good works, gave them hospitality. Thomas sat with Heinrich through the long nights, just as Heinrich had once sat with him during his plague fever. They talked about many things, about faith and doubt, about meaning and meaninglessness, about whether their years of wandering had accomplished anything worthwhile. "Do you have regrets?" Thomas asked one night when Heinrich's breathing was particularly labored. "Many," Heinrich admitted. "I regret that I couldn't save my family. I regret the years I spent in angry penance rather than gentle service. I regret the pain I caused myself and encouraged others to inflict on themselves. But I don't regret the journey. I don't regret meeting you and Peter and the others. I don't regret learning, slowly and painfully, what really matters." "What really matters?" Thomas asked, wanting to hear Heinrich say it. "Love," Heinrich said simply. "That's all, really. Just love. Love for God, however we understand God. Love for each other. Love for strangers who need help. Love even for ourselves, damaged and broken as we are. Everything else, the theology, the rituals, the penance, the certainty, all of that is just humans trying to systematize what can't be systematized. But love is real. Love matters. Love endures even when everything else fails." Heinrich died on a cold November morning, just as the bells were ringing for lauds. Thomas was holding his hand, and Peter and John were there too, and several of the monks who had grown fond of the old German flagellant. His last words were not a prayer or a theological statement, but something much simpler. "Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for not leaving me alone." They buried him in the monastery cemetery, with proper rites and prayers. The abbot himself officiated, calling Heinrich a pilgrim soul who sought God through suffering and found him finally in love. Thomas thought that was a fitting epitaph. After Heinrich's death, the group faced a decision. What now? They had been held together partly by Heinrich's leadership, his vision, his driving purpose. Without him, they needed to decide collectively what their purpose would be. They spent several days in discussion, sitting around the fire in the monastery's guest house, talking through options. Some wanted to continue wandering as they had been, offering help where needed. Others wanted to settle somewhere, to establish a more permanent presence. John, ever practical, pointed out that they were getting older. He was nearly 40 now. Thomas was 25. Peter was 23. And endless wandering was a young person's game. It was Brother Malcolm, one of the Scottish monks who had befriended them, who suggested a solution. "There's a small village about a day's journey from here," he said. "They lost their priest to the plague last year, and they've been without spiritual guidance since. They also lack anyone with healing skills. If your group were to settle there, you could serve that community. Thomas could act as priest, or at least as a lay religious leader, and you could all use your healing knowledge to care for the sick. It wouldn't be wandering, but it would be service. It would be a way to continue what you've been doing, but with more stability." The suggestion appealed to Thomas. He was tired of wandering, tired of never staying anywhere long enough to really know people or make a lasting difference. The idea of settling in one place, of building relationships over time, of being part of a community rather than just passing through, it felt right, like a natural evolution of the journey he had been on. The others agreed, some enthusiastically, others more reluctantly. They traveled to the village. It was called Kilmartin, a small settlement of perhaps 50 families nestled in a valley among the hills, and met with the village elders. The elders were initially skeptical of this group of English strangers with scarred backs and strange histories, but when Thomas demonstrated his reading and writing skills, his knowledge of scripture, his healing abilities, they warmed to the idea. A bargain was struck. The group would settle in Kilmartin, serving the village's spiritual and medical needs. In return, the village would provide them with a house, food, and acceptance into the community. It wasn't a formal arrangement sanctioned by the church. Thomas had no official authority to perform priestly functions, and the church might well condemn what they were doing as irregular, if not heretical. But in the chaos and disruption of the post-plague world, with so many priests dead and formal church structures breaking down, such informal arrangements were becoming common. They settled into their new life slowly, learning the rhythms of the village, getting to know the families, and establishing trust. Thomas led prayers on Sundays in the small stone church, reading from scripture and offering meditations on faith and suffering and hope. He baptized bobbies, blessed marriages, and buried the dead. He knew he had no official right to perform these functions, but someone had to do them, and he did his best to serve with humility and care. Peter took charge of their medical work, organizing their store of herbs and remedies, teaching interested villagers about healing practices. John used his military experience to help the village improve its defenses and organize its resources more efficiently. Others in their group contributed in their own ways, helping with harvests, repairing buildings, teaching children to read. Thomas found a deep satisfaction in this life that he had never found in the monastery. At Canterbury, religious life had been about withdrawing from the world, about creating a separate, holy space where monks could focus on prayer and contemplation. But here in Kilmartin, religion was woven into the fabric of daily life. Thomas wasn't separate from the people he served. He lived among them, knew their struggles and joys, shared in their celebrations, and mourned their losses. He became particularly close to a family named the MacLeods, Ewan, a farmer, his wife Mary, and their 4 children. Ewan was a thoughtful man who asked deep questions about faith and suffering, still wrestling with the loss of his parents and a younger brother to the plague. Mary was practical and kind, with a gift for making people feel welcomed and cared for. Their children ranged from age 4 to age 12, and Thomas found himself becoming almost an uncle to them, telling them stories, teaching the older ones to read, playing simple games with the younger ones. It was through the MacLeods that Thomas began to understand something he hadn't fully grasped before: family, community, the simple daily acts of love and care. These weren't distractions from spiritual life, but rather the very substance of it. God, if God existed, wasn't primarily found in grand theological insights or mystical experiences, but in the ordinary moments of human connection. A shared meal, a child's laughter, a friend's comfort in grief, the quiet satisfaction of work well done. One evening, about 6 months after they had settled in Kilmartin, Thomas was having dinner with the MacLeods when young Jamie, the 8-year-old son, asked him a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Brother Thomas," Jamie said, his face serious, "why does God let bad things happen to good people?" It was the eternal question, the one Thomas had been asking himself since Edmund's death, the one that had no good answer. He looked at Jamie's earnest face, and at the faces of the family gathered around the table, all waiting to hear what he would say. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I've been asking that question for years, and I still don't have a good answer. Bad things do happen to good people, terrible things, unjust things. People die who shouldn't die. People suffer who don't deserve to suffer. And I don't understand why God allows that, if God is truly loving and all-powerful." "Then how can you still believe?" Jamie asked, echoing the doubt that Thomas himself had felt so many times. Thomas thought carefully before answering. "I believe because I've seen that even in the midst of terrible suffering, humans are capable of extraordinary love and courage and kindness. I've seen strangers take in orphaned children, knowing it might kill them. I've seen people share their last piece of bread with neighbors who were starving. I've seen compassion persist even when it seemed like the whole world had gone mad with fear and death. And that kind of love, that has to come from somewhere. That has to mean something. So I choose to believe that God is present in that love, even if I don't understand why God allows suffering." "That's a good answer," Ewan said quietly. "Better than most priests could give." But Thomas wasn't sure it was a good answer. It was just the most honest answer he could give, an answer that admitted doubt and mystery, but still affirmed meaning and hope. Perhaps that was the best any human could do. The seasons turned, and Thomas and his companions became a permanent part of Kilmartin's life. The village prospered under their care. Fewer people died from treatable illnesses now that Peter's medical knowledge was available, and the spiritual life of the community deepened under Thomas's gentle guidance. The plague still appeared occasionally, claiming a life here and there, but its worst fury seemed to have passed. The world was beginning to heal, slowly, painfully, but healing nonetheless. Thomas thought often of all the people who had shaped his journey. Edmund, whose death had set him on this path. Heinrich, who had shown him how to make meaning from suffering. Margaret, who had taught him to heal. Lord Percy, who had shown unexpected mercy. Father William, who had helped when he didn't have to, and countless others whose names he had forgotten but whose kindness he remembered. He thought too of his parents, and wondered if they were still alive, if they ever thought of him, if they would approve of the life he had built. He liked to think they would, that his mother especially would be proud of the way he served others, that his father would respect the honest work he did, even if it wasn't the wheelwright's trade. One spring morning, 3 years after settling in Kilmartin, Thomas was walking through the village when he saw a familiar figure approaching from the south road. His heart leaped. It was Margaret, the healer who had saved his life, looking older and wearier but unmistakably her. They embraced like the old friends they were, and Margaret explained that she had been traveling through Scotland and heard rumors of an English religious community in Kilmartin, led by a man named Thomas who had once been a flagellant and had survived the plague. She had hoped it might be him, and she had come to see. "I needed to know if you were all right," she said simply. "You disappeared into exile, and I never knew what became of you." Thomas showed her around Kilmartin, introduced her to his companions and to the villagers, told her about Heinrich's death and their decision to settle. Margaret listened with approval, nodding at the work they had done, the lives they had touched. "You've done well," she said. "You've taken what I taught you and built something beautiful with it. This is exactly what I hoped for, practical service combined with spiritual care, healing of body and soul together." Margaret stayed with them for several weeks, and in that time, she and Thomas talked long into the night about all that had happened since they parted. She told him of her own travels, the people she had helped, the losses she had witnessed. The plague was finally waning on the continent, she reported, though its scars would mark that generation forever. Entire regions were depopulated, cities reduced to shadows of their former selves, noble families extinct, traditions and knowledge lost forever. "But life continues," Margaret said. "People rebuild, remarry, and have children. The world doesn't end, even when it seems like it must. Humans are resilient creatures. We suffer, we grieve, but we also hope and love and create. That's what I've learned in all my travels, that the human capacity for resilience and renewal is extraordinary." Before Margaret left to continue her travels, she asked Thomas a question. "Have you found what you were looking for? Have you made sense of the suffering, the way your friend Edmund asked you to?" Thomas thought about this carefully. "I don't think I've made sense of it," he said honestly. "I don't think suffering makes sense, not in any way that human minds can fully comprehend. But I've made something from it, a life of service, relationships that matter, a community that I love and that loves me in return. I've learned that meaning isn't something you find by understanding suffering, but something you create by how you respond to it. So in that sense, yes, I've found what I was looking for. Not answers, but a way to live without answers." Margaret smiled. That's wisdom, Thomas. That's exactly what I hoped you would discover. After Margaret departed, Thomas found himself reflecting on his entire journey, from the monastery at Canterbury to the Flagellants, through plague and exile to this small Scottish village. It had been a strange path, full of suffering and doubt and moments of despair. But it had also been full of love and growth and hard-won wisdom. He thought about the person he had been at 16, entering the monastery full of certainty and pious devotion, believing he understood God's purposes and the path to salvation. That person seemed like a stranger now. Thomas, at 28, had lived through things that 16-year-old Thomas could never have imagined. He had lost his faith and found it again, transformed into something more humble, more honest, more grounded in love than in certainty. One summer evening, as Thomas sat outside the church watching the sun set over the hills, young Jamie MacLeod came and sat beside him. The boy was 11 now, bright and thoughtful, full of questions about the world and faith and meaning. "Brother Thomas," Jamie said, "do you think the plague was God's punishment for sin?" It was a question Thomas had been asked many times over the years, and his answer had evolved. "I don't know," he said. "I used to think so. Many people still think so. But I've come to believe that maybe the plague was just a disease, a terrible, natural disaster that killed millions of people without any moral purpose at all. Maybe it wasn't punishment or lesson or divine plan. Maybe it was just tragedy." "But then where was God?" Jamie asked. "If it wasn't God's plan, if it was just a random disaster, then where was God while all those people died?" Thomas smiled at the boy's persistence. These were the right questions, the important questions, even if they had no satisfying answers. "I think God was in the people who stayed to care for the sick when others fled," Thomas said slowly. "God was in the mothers who took in orphan children. God was in the healers who worked until they dropped from exhaustion. God was in the strangers who showed kindness to strangers. God wasn't in the plague itself, but in the human response to the plague, in the love and courage and compassion that persisted even in the midst of horror. At least that's what I choose to believe." Jamie thought about this. So God doesn't stop bad things from happening, but God is with us when bad things happen. "Yes," Thomas said. "I think that's it exactly. God doesn't prevent suffering, but God suffers with us, through us as us. And God calls us to be present with each other in suffering, to not leave each other alone, to keep loving even when love leads to loss." "That seems like not enough," Jamie said. "I wish God would just stop the bad things from happening in the first place." "So do I," Thomas said honestly. "So do I." They sat together in companionable silence as the light faded from the sky, and Thomas felt a deep peace settling over him. Not the peace of having all the answers, but the peace of having learned to live with questions, to find meaning not in understanding, but in love and service. The years continued to pass in their gentle rhythm. Thomas grew older, his hair beginning to show threads of silver, his body bearing the accumulated marks of his journey, the scars on his back from flagellation, the mark on his temple from the stone thrown in violence, the lines around his eyes from years of grief and laughter both. He performed his duties faithfully, leading the villagers in worship, caring for the sick, teaching the children, burying the dead when their time came, and celebrating with them in their joys. Peter married a village woman named Catherine and had 3 children of his own. John took over management of the village's defenses and became a respected elder. The others in their group found their own places in the community's life, contributing their gifts, becoming woven into the fabric of Kilmartin in ways that made it impossible to remember a time when they hadn't been there. Thomas never married, though not from any remaining sense of monastic vows. He simply found that his life was full enough with the community he served, the children he taught, the sick he tended. He was uncle to half the village's children, friend to most of the adults, confidant to many. It was a rich life, a meaningful life, even if it wasn't the life he had imagined for himself as a young man entering the monastery. On his 40th birthday, Thomas stood in the churchyard looking at the graves of those who had died since he came to Kilmartin. There weren't many. The village was small, and most people lived to a reasonable age now that the plague had receded. But each grave represented a life he had known, a story he had witnessed, a soul he had tried to care for. He thought of all the other graves he had seen, the mass graves outside London, the monastery cemetery where Heinrich lay, the countless unmarked places where plague victims had been buried in haste and fear. So much death, so much suffering, and yet life continued. Children were born, crops were planted, people fell in love and built homes and created beauty. The world had not ended, though it had seemed certain to do so during the worst of the plague years. Humanity had survived, scarred and diminished, but still capable of hope, still capable of love. He thought of Edmund, his dear friend whose death had set him on this long, strange journey. He wished Edmund could see what his life had become, and could know that his last request had been honored. Thomas hadn't made sense of the suffering. He doubted anyone ever truly could, but he had made something from it. He had built a life dedicated to ensuring that others didn't suffer alone, that love and compassion persisted even in the darkest times, that meaning could be created even when understanding was impossible. "I kept my promise," Thomas whispered to his long-dead friend. "As best I could. I hope it was enough." The wind rustled through the trees around the churchyard, and somewhere in the village, he heard children laughing as they played. Life continuing its ancient dance, weaving joy and sorrow together into the complex tapestry of human existence. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas walked back toward the village. Mary MacLeod had invited him to dinner, and the family would be waiting. There would be warmth and food and conversation, the simple gifts of community and belonging. There would be questions from the children, stories from Ewan, Mary's quiet kindness. There would be, for a few hours, the peace of being exactly where he was meant to be. This was what he had learned through all his wandering, through all his suffering and doubt and searching. That meaning wasn't found in grand theological answers or mystical certainties, but in the ordinary moments of love and service. That faith wasn't about having all the answers, but about choosing compassion and hope even in the absence of answers. That the purpose of life wasn't to understand suffering, but to ensure that no one suffered alone. That love persisted even when death seemed to have the final word. The flagellant scourge lay buried somewhere in his past, along with the fierce certainty of his youth and the desperate grief that had driven him to seek redemption through blood and pain. What remained was simpler and deeper, a commitment to be present, to serve, to love as best he could for as long as he was given. As he reached MacLeod's door and heard the warm voices inside welcoming him home, Thomas felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Not gratitude for the suffering he had endured. He would never be grateful for that, but gratitude for what he had learned through it, for the people he had met, for the life he had built from the ashes of his old certainties. He knocked gently and the door swung open, releasing light and warmth and the smell of fresh bread into the gathering darkness. Jamie stood there, grinning up at him. "We've been waiting for you, Brother Thomas. Come in, come in." And Thomas stepped across the threshold into the warmth, leaving the cold and darkness behind, embraced by the simple, enduring grace of human connection. This, he thought, was as close to heaven as mortals could hope to find, not in some distant reward after death, but here, now, in the love we share with one another, in the meaning we create together, in our refusal to let suffering be the end of the story. The door closed behind him, and inside the small house, a family gathered around their table, sharing a meal and their lives with a man who had wandered far and suffered much, but had finally found his way home. In the years that followed, Thomas would continue his quiet work in Kilmartin until his own death at the age of 62, surrounded by people who loved him, having touched more lives than he could count, having made a difference in ways both large and small. He would be buried in the churchyard beside those he had served, and the village would remember him not as a failed monk or a heretical flagellant, but simply as Brother Thomas, who had loved them well and taught them that faith was not about certainty, but about choosing compassion even in the face of mystery. And perhaps in the end, that was enough. Perhaps that was everything. Rest now, dear listener, and let this story carry you gently into sleep. Let it remind you that even in the darkest times, even when meaning seems impossible to find, we can create it through how we love and serve and refuse to let suffering have the final word. Let it remind you that we are all, in our own ways, pilgrims seeking purpose, and that the journey itself, with all its pain and beauty, is what shapes us into who we are meant to be. Sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful.